Well, today, of course, we find ourselves smack dab in the middle of Advent, and I think for the most part, people generally know what Advent is all about. So Advent is all about preparing for the coming of Christ. So the whole idea is that Christ has come, Christ is coming, Christ in a certain sense is already here. So mindful of all that, how do we prepare for the coming of Christ? Whether we're talking about the first coming, Christ born in a manger in a little town of Bethlehem, or the second coming, the end times, the final judgment, the whole 9 yards. That said, kind of begs the obvious question, what does that mean practically speaking? For insight, certainly we can look at the readings associated in the lectionary for the season of Advent. But also we can look at certain elements in Catholic culture, especially the Advent wreath. So the Advent wreath, as you know, it's built around evergreens, which points to the fact that the Lord always is offering us eternal life. Not simply duration, but quality, the fullness of life, the fullness of sharing in his own blessed life. But of course, the Advent wreath is primarily built around those candles, 4, sometimes 5. Sometimes you'll find a 5th candle, a white candle to indicate Christmas, but the main thing, it's built around 4 candles, 3 of which are purple, 1 of which is pink. The pink candle indicates a certain shift. So Advent always begins around the Feast of St. Andrew, so it can begin from the end of November to the beginning of December. But in any case, it's always 4 weeks. The first 2 weeks are meant to focus on the second coming of Christ, the end times. One day the Lord will come. We will have to give an account for the things we have done, the things we have failed to do. But then, on the 3rd week, there's the pink candle to indicate, again, a certain shift. Now, because Christmas is around the corner, we're focused on the first coming of Christ. Christ coming as a child born in a manger in the little town of Bethlehem. But more to the point, all the different candles, they represent certain themes, which is very instructive. It tells us that even though the general vibe when it comes to Advent is preparation, each of those candles tell us how we're called to prepare when it comes to the first week, the second week, the 3rd week, and the 4th week. So, first candle is all about hope. Now again, you think about the second coming of Christ. Maybe the first thing that comes to mind is not so much hope, maybe it's fear and shaking in your boots, right? But again, the first candle is all about hope. Kind of playing on the theology of Pope Benedict XVI. The end times. Certainly it's a time of reckoning. Also, this is the time when the various strands of human history will come together according to God's providential designs. This is a time when every tear will be wiped away, new heaven, new earth, all things being made new. And mindful of the fact that that will happen, according to God's providence, I have hope now. Second candle, it's about preparation. So this is the more conventional thought when it comes to the final judgment. I am called to give an account for the things I've done, the things I failed to do at the end of my life, mindful that life, especially my life, is short. 3rd candle, it's about joy. It's a pink candle, right? You got to remember that in a certain sense, the Christmas story is primarily the story of the Israelite people, the holy people of God. What can we say about the Israelite people? A people long under affliction, a long-suffering people, oppression, slavery, the whole 9 yards. And so the coming of the Messiah would have meant something really special to them. And so they had a sense of joyful expectation. The Messiah is coming. Salvation is close. Our redemption is near. Final candle, love. Goes to God's intention. It goes to the identity of God. God is love. And he chooses out of love in the fullness of time to send his only begotten Son on a rescue mission to save you, to save us, to save his family. If you reflect deeply on that and you meditate on that particular point, you realize that implied in that is a certain calling, an invitation. I'm also called to become another Christ in this world, also a person of love. I'm called to love others as Christ has loved me. I'm called to forgive others as Christ has forgiven me. So those are the 4 candles associated with the Advent wreath. Now you hold that thought and you think about this weekend. So this is the 2nd Sunday at Advent. So the theme is preparation. Preparation in the context of the second coming, preparing for the fact that eventually in time, I will have to give an account for the things I've done, the things I failed to do in the context of the final judgments. You think about the Gospel. Gospel of Matthew chapter 3 is the story of John the Baptist. You hear many things in this story, but one thing which comes across is that John the Baptist is the one who was long foretold on the lips of the prophet Isaiah. This is the one whose voice is crying out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord and make straight his paths." Prepare the way of the Lord and make straight his paths. A really famous expression that you find in the context of Advent. Kind of weird, but also very specific, very instructive, immensely practical. It gives us a certain image as to God's grace. God's grace is coming. God's grace is already present. And so therefore, what's my duty? What's my task? Not to manufacture this grace, not even to summon it. It's already coming. It's already here. What am I called to do to dispose myself to become more receptive to God's grace, to his presence, both of which are coming and in a certain sense are already here? The analogy that comes to mind, imagine you are on a deserted island and you're not just hungry, you're not just starving, but you are like dying. If someone doesn't come, you will surely perish. And all of a sudden, this helicopter comes, and it contains everything that you need. Not just things that you need, but everything you need to flourish, to fulfill all your hopes and your dreams and your deep desires, right? That's the particular image of God's grace and his providence. So therefore, what's my duty? What's my task? Not to build a helicopter, not to pilot the helicopter, not even to summon the helicopter. The helicopter is already coming. The helicopter is already here. What can I do in terms of adjustments in my life to receive the gift of salvation? Here's the helicopter, which is meant to save me, meant to save my life. The adjustments I make, that's what I'm called to do in the context of the Advent season. A couple examples just to kind of flesh this out. Recently, I saw this talk by Anthony Robbins, this really famous motivational speaker. And he was addressing this audience, especially this young man. Basically, this young man was struggling with issues of self-esteem, identity, self-worth. He was wearing a hoodie, shorts, and these really bright red sneakers. And so Tony Robbins began by saying, "Why do you hate yourself? Is it because of the red shoes?" And the guy was like, "What? Is it because of the red shoes?" And he looked down and he's like, "No. Are you sure? Because they're really red." And at this point, the guy realized that Tony Robbins was pulling his leg, and he started to smile. And Tony Robbins, he was a couple feet away from the guy, and in this really tender gesture, he touched his face. He said, "Don't be smiling. You're going to mess it up. Keep on smiling like that. You're going to want to stick around." I love how you have really high standards for yourself. That's great. I love that. But something that people do all the time, people tend to overestimate what they can accomplish in a single year. At the same time, they tend to underestimate what they can accomplish in 2 decades, 3 decades. And he looked at this young man, and he said, "Look, you got time. The reason why you don't understand this thing that I said to be true is because you haven't lived your life yet. And more to the point, you haven't given yourself permission to be patient with yourself." I think if you give yourself a little more time, and you give yourself permission to love yourself just a little bit more, I think you'll realize in time you have a whole lot more to give. I don't just know that, I feel that in my bones. I remember watching that video and thinking, that's a really good way to articulate this thing we're talking about with regards to Advent. You think about the Advent season, you think about preparation. Certainly, if there's something that you're called to do, something dramatic which can bring about a certain fruitfulness, like in the moment, right away, obviously, do that. If there's something you're doing or not doing that you need to kind of adjust to bring yourself back into the right relationship with God, by all means, don't hesitate. Do it with great generosity, intentionality, and bravery. Jordan Peterson, right? What's something that you're doing wrong, that you know you're doing wrong, that you could fix, that you should fix? What's something you're doing wrong that you know you're doing wrong, which you could fix, which you should fix? Why wait? Do that thing immediately. But here's the point. The typical way that God's grace works in your life, the typical way that conversion works in your life, it's slow. What's something small, seemingly insignificant, that I can do right now? which will bear fruit over a long period of time. That's the thing you're called to do in the season of Advent. That's a typical way that God's grace works. One final example on with this. So recently I was corresponding with a friend of mine who was sharing a story about a painful experience involving her family. And so my friend was wrestling with a kid who was being really difficult, being really rebellious. And I said to her, my initial thought, maybe you need to recalibrate your expectations. And so instead of trying to resolve the situation in a definitive sort of way right away, maybe recalibrate your expectations such that all you need to do is simply manage the situation. There's a certain victory in getting through a really painful day to live to fight another day. And at first she kind of misunderstood what I was saying. So she said, yeah, Father, you're called to take it one day at a time. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I think a lot of times when it comes to really difficult, problematic, complex situations, we tend to bring to the table a certain false expectation for ourselves. Is this something I need to do? Is this something I need to achieve? Is this something I need to become? According to this timeline I have in the back of my mind. And when I don't do the thing that I think I should do, if I don't become the person that I think I should be, I'm not just disappointed, I see that as a moral failure. I failed myself, I failed my family, I failed my kids, and I failed God. And God is so disappointed. Nope. You always got to go back to the words of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. God doesn't call you to be successful, God calls you to be faithful. Complex problems, complex relationships, by definition, they're difficult to resolve. They're typically not resolved overnight. And so what's required, what is essential, is patience. Truckloads of patience for the situation, for the other person, but especially for yourself. If you're faithful in terms of doing a few things the Lord wants you to do carefully and well to help move the situation along, to manage the situation, even though it remains messy, even though it remains incomplete, sleep well. Maintain peace of heart. The Lord is very pleased that you're not backing away from the situation, which is difficult, but instead, you're doing your best to fight the fight that He wants you to fight. And God bless you for that.